Thank you to everyone for being here, and for Oscar and Catherine and Kirsten for the invitation. So I want to start with a little bit of background about me, people who might not know me, who don't know me, and attempt to explain where this project has come from. So this work stems from a broad interest I have in something that I've called collective auditory knowledge, and thinking about shared responses to sonic phenomenon. So my main preoccupation is a sort of probably fruitless attempt to uncover what people might have thought when they heard something and what they then did as a result. I'm interested in how this type of knowledge manifests in a society and how it's shaped, created, and exploited. Most well known, perhaps, is its association with capitalism, where today we advertise particular products to specific melodies. And as we all know, this was no less true for the early modern period, where, for example, news sheets were sold and circulated to familiar and regularly recycled tunes, as the work of many people in this room and in the virtual room, as their work has shown. I've lost my train of thought now. Balladeers deliberately chose specific tunes to heighten their ballads' effective potency, as sensationalist songs offered a lucrative source of income. So understanding collective auditory knowledge in terms of how individuals attended to their acoustic world, as well as how this was manipulated and shaped, is therefore vitally important if we are to fully understand past societies, a contention that everyone in this room will not find particularly revolutionary or revelatory. I started thinking about this several years ago when I began work on Catholic uses of music in post-Reformation England, and particularly when I realised that missionary priests, particularly Jesuits, were adapting popular songs to evangelise the laity in England, a practice that was well known in their missions throughout the world, but this is happening in England as well. And one favourite melody for adaptation, for example, was the ballad tune "Dainty Come Thou to Me," which, unless Rothstuffen is here and could tell me, is something that I don't think we still know what the melody is, but I would love it if someone does find out what that is. Anyway, but my talk today might then seem like something of a gear shift, although I continue to be preoccupied with subversive music making, I seem to have wandered firmly into the musical mainstream by arriving at the metrical psalter, or the whole book of Psalms, collected into English metre by Thomas Sternhold, Thomas Hopkins and others, first printed in 1562. And I found myself here after thinking about what the most popular songs and melodies of the age were, and asking questions then about what or who were the agents and drivers of early modern popular culture. And so I end up thinking about the whole book of Psalms and asking myself what role it played as an agent of collective auditory knowledge. So the whole book of Psalms is certainly the most ubiquitous songbook of the entire period. And the immense popularity of congregational metrical psalmody in post-Reformation England is now well established. Christopher Marsh has argued it was the Reformation's greatest success and certainly its loudest. Beth Quitzen's pioneering work identified the whole book of Psalms as a uniquely flexible and effective instrument for advancing visions of a godly polity and community. The whole book of Psalms' success, visible in its longevity among worshippers, occupying an entire spectrum of Protestant views. Singing from the metrical psalter, as Jonathan Willis has also outlined, was at the very heart of Protestant piety. Conservative estimates from Quitland and Ian Green have suggested that 220,000 copies of the whole book of Psalms were likely in circulation by 1603, and perhaps as many as 1 million by the 1640s. As Templey and Quitland have put it so aptly in their phenomenal critical edition, such was its ubiquity, the text that made up the whole book of Psalms must have been among the most familiar in the English language for close to 3 centuries, and the tunes to which they were sung a musical vernacular common to everyone in the kingdom and many English settlements abroad. How much of this musical vernacular actually came from the whole book of Psalms, particularly after the 1590s, is a question that scholars have grappled with a few exceptions, such as Psalm 100, which you may know as "All People That on Earth Do Dwell." I won't sing it for you. So with a few exceptions like that one, Marsh has argued that English congregations found most of the 8-line melodies of the whole book of Psalms unsuitable, preferring instead a new generation of 4-line tunes, many of them named after historical towns or cities that they supposedly originated from. And Marsh has also demonstrated the movement between the official and the common tunes, and suggested that it was likely composers, local composers or experimental congregations, he says, constructing new, shorter melodies, drawing freely upon the more memorable phrases from the official psalter. Samantha Arton's doctoral work develops this further, arguing that although the whole book of Psalms was intended to promote musical literacy to men, women, and children across the social spectrum, and she argues this really convincingly, this aim, though, she says, ultimately failed due to printing errors. And moreover, Arton's recent survey, published last year, of 222 surviving Elizabethan copies of the Psalm book suggested as well that the Psalter's success was actually due, at least in part, to audiences failing to use it as directed. Through their dynamic interactions, Arton has suggested the whole book of Psalms was a book more to be read, she says, from than a compendium of musical tunes for communal singing. So my study builds on Arton's important work and will look for evidence, and has started looking for evidence of reception on around 1,000 copies of the whole book of Psalms, printed from 1562 to the 1640s, because I had to limit it in some way. There were editions that went much later than that, but this is the time frame I've set myself across cathedral archives, major institutional repositories, and university libraries, in order to understand and expand our understanding of the role of the whole book of Psalms in the lives, and particularly the households, of the early modern populace. So evidence for the use of the whole book of Psalms beyond the parish church is elusive, and scholars have remained somewhat tentative in their conclusion. The domestic life of the metrical psalter, for example, has been deemed difficult to gauge and difficult to measure. It's supposedly hard to determine from documentary evidence precisely how it was used in actual practice, and these quotes are behind me here, who they're from. And it has been suggested that surviving copies can tell us very little about the ways that it was actually used. And it is easy to see why scholars have come to this conclusion. Large numbers of copies of the whole book of Psalms show no sign of use at all. But systematic examination of a much larger corpus can, I hope, tell us more. And my overall project aims to demonstrate the ways in which the whole book of Psalms, as both a material text and also an acoustic object, and by that I mean an object that prompts an audible response, kind of out loud from its user, was embedded within the spiritual lives of post-Reformation men and women beyond the parish church. To give you a sense of what I've done so far, so basically as soon as the archives opened, this all came from me just desperately wanted to do something in an archive after the pandemic. So in the summer of 2021, I examined all of the surviving copies of the whole book of Psalms in York Minster and Rare Books libraries, at Canterbury and watched the Cathedral archives, alongside all the copies at Senate House and also the British Library, much to their dismay, because they had loads of limits on because of COVID, and I was just like, but could I just maybe have 50 today then, please? Anyway, in my 4-hour window that I've had to book in advance. And then this summer, I looked at all of the copies held in Lambeth Palace Library, and then about half of the relevant copies in the Bodleian. So in all, I've looked at 525 copies to date. And then throughout this year, I hope to finish the Bodleian copies, go to Cambridge, and then at some point I'd like to go to the Huntington, because Christ. There's no real logical reason to that other than that just sounds great, and they've got about 300 copies there. And so some caveats here. So I've done a lot of data collection, I've taken loads of photos. I'm still really very much in a processing and exploration phase. And so what follows really is a little bit of show and tell. As you all saw, my PowerPoint is apparently 1,000 kilobytes. And so there isn't anything profound or concrete about to come here. I'm really embracing the spirit of the study day. And I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to learn from all the expertise that we have here in this room, and for everyone joining us online. And I welcome any advice or feedback that you have. So some basics that everybody who is aware of, I'll set out. So studying the reception of a printed text means that I'm looking for any sign at all of ownership or use, such as manuscript marginalia, which, as the pioneering work of scholars such as Lisa Jardine and Anthony Grafton have established, can tell us something about the cultural, social, theological, and personal inclinations of historical book owners. And yet, as Bill Sherman also encountered in his phenomenal work on marginalia, I quickly discovered that a large proportion of the surviving copies of the whole book of Psalms have no signs of use at all. Many of these copies have been rebound, which is an issue for the historian of reception, whereas Harvard curator of rare books, Roger Stoddard, put it so aptly and much more politely than I would put it here. Rare is the binder who has deliberately preserved historical evidence. Bleaching. Oh, anyway, bleaching pages, unbelievable. So 59% of the British Library copies, oh, and this is, I should also say that large institutional repositories buy lots of books on mass, on block, it's called, and that means they have a disproportionate number of copies of books with no marks in. Anyway, so 59% of the BL copies I perused have got signs of use and ownership. But that is lower than, for example, proportion of copies in cathedral archives. So Canterbury has 67%, have signs of use, and 70% at York. It's not too bad then. The quality of the marks, however. Anyway, so of the 314 copies that have signs of use before 1800 as well, so some copies I have excluded will have signs of marks that are quite obviously 19th century or later, and they are off the shelf unless they have obvious 18th century or earlier markings. And I've divided the reception evidence into three straightforward categories: marks that do not engage at all with the printed contents, marks that do, and then finally, I just wanted to focus on this more because this wonderful, the material reception of the metrical psalter through the use of embroidered bindings. So marks that do not engage at all for the text itself include provenance marks. So over 80% of the copies that I have provenance marks. Miscellaneous, oh, so this is Grace and Cordelia Caldecott, her book. I think this is embroidered, this one from memory. So then there's miscellaneous writing, everything that's uncategorizable really. And then mathematical calculations. Other forms of accounting, such as this annotation, which is, be it known unto all men that I, William Fuller of Buckingham, do owe and acknowledge myself to be indebted unto Thomas Warlick of Burston, the sum of £5 of goods and £10 to be paid, blah, blah, blah. So just making a note to himself. The types of marks that do interact with the content of the whole book of Psalms, are therefore more interesting, include, and pen practice, sorry. And doodles, I've skipped through, sorry, there are more. Pen trials and letter practice on 35% of copies. Doodles and drawings, sorry, I can't speak, drawing about 7%. And that includes this man here in the corner. It's fun. There he is, hanging out on his psalter. So, forgive me, types of marks that do. Oh, I'm really just failing at life to read my script here. Genealogical, in fairness, I've not written this down. Finally, there is genealogical information, such as this. Sorry for my total incompetence. Can you tell I finished this morning? Right, marks that do interact with the content of the whole book of Psalms itself, I've just going to race to the good bit, include sermon notes and instructions on how to use the Psalms. So this is an extract from Lewis Bailey's 1611 Practice of Piety and his rules to be observed in singing of Psalms. And this has been copied on the blank verso of the title page of a 1615 edition that's now in Canterbury Cathedral Archive. So I would assume that this is a minister that has, or at least a parish clerk. This is someone responsible for Psalms, and I'm assuming a parish priest copy here. In other copies, there are prayers, like this one on the back of a title page of a 1616 copy, religious verse. So this is this copy is from William Hogarth's family. So I think it might have been his grandmother. And this is a 1616 psalter, and there's a religious verse on the side here which says something: "Thy sin, thy death, and death of Christ, and eternal pains of hell, the day of doom and heaven's joy, these six remember well." It's written there. So other marginalia that engages with the Psalms includes initials, underlining, and manicules, pointing to meaningful contents. And then musical engagement specifically is much less common, and it corroborates, I think, a sort of emerging consensus that perhaps the whole book of Psalms did not directly offer England's musical vernacular in lots of ways. But you do see people occasionally practicing out, copying notes and staves. Yeah, so a little attempt here. And then in one 1608 copy, which is in Fenwick House, the owner has written on, again, there's a title page, they've written out the melodies of 8 common tunes, so Gloucester, Winchester, Cambridge, York, Low Dutch, and then at the bottom is the tune of St David's. There is a random, I don't know how random it is, the 100 is not the tune of Old 100, the All People That on Earth Do Dwell tune. It's a different tune, so I need to go and have a little look at what that is. I haven't checked the obvious places for that yet, but anyway, TBC about what that is exactly. And then finally, another way of musically engaging with the whole book of Psalms is, as you can see up here, is noting how many page turns it is to get to the melody as it is notated. So you've got that as well. So other users also copied out verses of the metrical psalter, often elsewhere in the whole book of Psalms. This is Psalm 27 that's been transcribed opposite some of the preparatory material, which is Athanasius's treatise, in a 1598 copy. And then others recorded specific responses to Psalms in the margin. So this person here has written, "My soul gives thanks unto the Lord," on this copy. And then in another copy, we have a comment next to Psalm 70, which said that this psalm was sung at the Earl of Essex's execution. And I then got really excited. I was like, oh my goodness, maybe they were at the Earl of Essex's execution, like, and then no, apparently that, like, this is a really common thing for people to love to say, that all of these different psalms were all sung at the Earl of Essex's execution. So I haven't actually identified evidence of an actual performance. It's just someone, I don't know, rumor or something, but it has obviously got meaning that they would write that next to that anyway. Finally, user engagement with the whole book of Psalms is evident from embroidered bindings, which I've currently looked at 53 copies. The earliest one I saw covered a 1584 edition, and the detail you can see on this slide. And then there's another from 1587, but the majority, the remaining 1581, are covering editions from 1606 to 1644. And embroidered covers like this, to quote Claire Canavan and her brilliant PhD thesis, tied the book to the clothed body and the material environment. They not only mark the book as a fashionable, aesthetic and treasured object, but suggest how reading materials might be applied in embodied as well as intellective ways. Nice addition to our soundscaping here there. So the majority of the covers of these 53 editions depict flowers, as you can see here on the slide. But pictorial versions of scriptural stories can also be found. For example, this British Library copy shows a binding of a 1613 edition and features King Solomon on the upper cover and Jacob wrestling with an angel on the lower. David was another popular choice, and these depictions foregrounded his composition of the Psalter. So on the left, we have a binding of a 1640 edition, and this portrays David's triumph over Goliath. And on the right, you've got David playing a part for Saul. And so the image of David's musical performance driving away the evil spirits troubling Saul's mind emphasized the role of psalm singing for spiritual comfort, and as a result emphasizes the way that fabric bindings were chosen by their owners to cohere with the content. Embroidered bindings might also foreground their provenance. So this here is a folio, really large volume of the whole book of Psalms. It's also bound with a Book of Common Prayer and a Bible, and it's embroidered with the arms of James Montague, Bishop of Winchester, and it's all set within a frame of vines symbolizing Christ. So of the 312 copies of the whole book of Psalms that show signs of use, 144 of them leave enough information in order to identify the families that these particular texts belong to. And so 49 were owned by women, 57 by men, and 38 had both male and female owners from the same family. These are just the people that have written their names. So obviously could have been owned by other people that chose not to write their names. And so there are observations that can tentatively be made at this point about the different ways that men and women might have used their copies of the whole book of Psalms. So just some quite straightforward, basic observations. So men and women were equally likely to annotate their books. It's not that there are more annotations in copies by women, say, than by men. But I have noticed that the types of marks can have some differences, so do with this information what you will. So surviving copies known to have been owned by men were 3 times more likely to have doodles in them and in little images. Copies owned by women were 5 times more likely to contain genealogical information, and surviving copies known to be owned by women were also 3 times more likely to have prayers in, twice as likely to contain transcriptions of religious verse. And I do want to think more about the female owners of the whole Book of Psalms, and what hopefully this project will do will be to continue to contribute to what we already know about the role of women in upholding the spiritual household. But at the same time, I also want to critique the generalization that embroidered books particularly were more typically owned by women, because that is not the impression that I have had from looking at the Psalters. There's just as many copies that there's not a lot of provenance information on the Psalters, admittedly, but the ones where there is, there's just as many that are known to have been owned by men. I'm going to very quickly show you my favourite Psalter, and you'll have to forgive the digression because it's not specifically about music, what is about to come, really. So this is a 1583 edition of Beza's New Testament in quarto, and it's bound with the whole Book of Psalms. The first owner was Elizabeth Hill Bullingham, whose hand you can see here on the pages. Elizabeth was born in 1535 and was one of the many children of William Locke, merchant adventurer and supporter of early reform. Won't deal with that bit. The last certain early modern owner of the volume is Dorothy Palmer, who died in 1690. And we know that Palmer had this volume because it is referred to in the autobiography of her brother, who was an MP, Sir John Brampston. And he describes in his autobiography this book's careful preservation by the females in the family, and it is now in the hands of my sister Lady Palmer, having been given to her by Mary, our grandmother. And I know he's talking about this volume because of how he describes the material transcribed into his prefatory pages, into its pages. So Brampston and Palmer's grandmother was Mary Mountford. These are her initials stamped into the front page, into the binding, sorry. And Mary was one of Elizabeth's daughters from her first marriage to Richard Hill, who was another merchant, before his death in 1568. Elizabeth then marries Nicholas Bullingham, Bishop of Lincoln and Worcester, who was the bishop who gave Byrd his job, I think, just to try and tie it tenuously into early music. And he died in 1576. Bullingham didn't marry again and lived until sometime after 1604, as that's the last dated annotation in her hand that I can find in the volume. So her earliest dated annotations are to around 1590, and they're on nearly every page of the text. The New Testament is filled with annotations, and they include what I think are dates of sermons that she's heard, often who gave them, where they were. And then the whole Book of Psalms is also marked. She has corrections, underlines text, and occasionally the music, not as common, but does correct the music as well. She adds her initials to various psalms, presumably her favourites. And here in the table to the Psalter, which is on the right here, she is also, there's lots of marginalia filling the bottom of the page in ways that are characteristic of the whole volume. So the prefatory material is particularly interesting, as it contains a number of prayers she composes, and also a short autobiography, which is in her own hand on the left, and then in a later hand from one of her descendants on the right. As well as her own autobiography, there's also a copy of her sister, and her sister is Rose Hickman Throckmorton. And for any Reformation historians, basically, just to wrap up, Rose Hickman Throckmorton also wrote an autobiography of her time as a Protestant exile. Elizabeth, her sister, was with her as well. And I found an unknown source copy of that autobiography that's also in here. Perhaps not super exciting for early music historians, but quite exciting for Reformation historians. Anyway, to draw this all together, by way of conclusion, it's quite obvious, a lot of questions of this material that have been left both unasked and unanswered. But I hope I've at least started to show you how systematic examination of surviving copies can tell us a great deal about the whole Book of Psalms and its use and its significance in people's lives, its contents embodying the shifting boundaries between parish and household and between text and performance, even if this performance was not quite as its creators might have intended. The volumes I've seen so far already show vivid evidence of the way this ubiquitous acoustic object was firmly embedded within the spiritual lives of its owners. Thank you for listening.